Welcome to StabtheDragon Productions. Today I'm reviewing a fiction thriller about politics, espionage, terrorism, special operations by a retired U.S. Navy SEAL, Commander Jack Carr. Now, I chose this book not just because I liked it, but because I consider it to be important. It's current, and I dare say prophetic. The Devil's Hand by Jack Carr is published by Emily Bestler Books from Simon & Schuster, New York, 2021. This weighs in at 524 pages, and this is Carr's fourth book in the James Reece series. Now, why should anybody read this book? First of all, the genre is thriller, so if you like thrillers, then here you go. We're dealing with espionage, terrorism, political shenanigans, the military, good guys versus bad guys, serious time crunch before something really bad happens. There are scenes of incredibly graphic violence here, lots of scary scenarios. But if you particularly like the scientific and medical type thrillers, this is especially for you. So mix in some bioterror, some biological warfare with the political espionage thing. There you go. That's what this is. For you older folks like me, think about maybe Andromeda Strain to an extent. But also, if you want to know a little bit about sleeper cells, immigration issues, and how Islamists view us, this book is for you. So that's who should read this book. And this is part of a series. Okay, so this is book number 4 in the series. Would you be able to just pick this book up and enjoy it without reading the previous 3? Yes, particularly if you have an interest in the biological warfare aspect. But otherwise, I would always recommend that you go back and start with the first book in the series, which is here, Terminal List. And then the second one, True Believer. And then the third one, Savage Son. So let me give you just a little bit of a summary of who the protagonist is, James Reece, in this series. He was a U.S. Navy SEAL, lieutenant commander, equivalent to a major in Army rank, whose unit got destroyed in an ambush in Afghanistan. And upon arriving home, as one of only a couple survivors of this ambush, Reece is then immediately confronted by the murders of his other surviving teammate and of his own wife and daughter in separate but near simultaneous incidents that create a lot of suspicion. After a brief time of recovery from his own injuries and grief, Reece then begins his investigation of the deaths of his teammates and of his family. The book series then follows Reece as he basically goes rogue, seeking vengeance against those who have betrayed him, who sabotaged his team and murdered his family. Then he begins working for the government unofficially, and now officially, as he's joined the CIA. The plot of this book, Devil's Hand. This book goes into a deep dive on the attacks of 9/11 to an extent, and it touches even on the 1983 Marine Corps barracks bombing in Lebanon in order to build the framework for an Iranian plot to unleash a bioweapon inside the United States. Reece, who in Carr's last novel, Savage Son, signed on with the CIA, is still in training when he is summoned by the new president, Alec Christensen. Now, Christensen lost his fiancée in the towers on 9/11, proceeded to join the Army Rangers, fight in the war, got wounded, got out of the Army, went into the tech sector in California, got wealthy, got some tech knowledge, got into politics on the Democrat side, but as a more conservative Democrat. He was a legit war hero, certified patriot, and a tech-savvy millionaire, so he won the presidency in 2020. Not your typical Democrat by any means. This president then calls Reece in and gives him a secret mission that is both personal and with the national interest in mind. But is it legal? Is it ethical? Meanwhile, a team of Iranian terrorists, sleeper cell members, some of whom have secret ties to 9/11 themselves, are participating in a biological warfare strike in America. This strike has its roots going far back to World War II, the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and even in Africa. What happens when a hemorrhagic fever is unleashed in America just immediately after COVID? This story gives a very likely scenario, tying together medical science, politics, Islamic jihad, history, and one each CIA recruit, James Reece. The story is on a very tight timeline, with the key events happening in just a few days. And this is the only part of the story where I think the plot has a weakness. Now most fiction authors do have to engage in a little bit of what I call Hollywooding up or Hollywoodization, where they spice up the action or the speed of the timeline to a level that is a bit unrealistic, admittedly, but it works for the story. Okay, movies do it even worse. But some authorial license is allowed here, certainly. Carr does not overdo this at all in his novels. But the response times in this novel for the military and the National Guard and the science are simply too compressed, I think. However, including the work of a few doctors in the book was a genius idea. I mean, it really works. It demonstrates that national defense is not always just exclusively guys with guns. Now it includes doctors, nurses, veterinarians, certainly. This part of the story was excellent, if a bit rushed. They're not mentioned. I thought of the sci-fi thriller from the 1970s Andromeda strain repeatedly throughout the book. The action sequences in the story are typical of Carr, very similar to Brad Taylor's stories of Pike Logan. Lots of hand-to-hand combat, gunfights, and these are not for the faint of heart. They're pretty explicit. There's one fight scene that stands out to me from this book. It takes place in a burning house. So there you've got the house is on fire. The combatants are dressed in complete viral protective suits, the mask and the air tank and all that stuff. That was intense. That was an intense hand-to-hand combat sequence. And genius, by the way. The action sequences really, I mean, if you thrive on those, Carr delivers. Absolutely. The welcome addition of Reece's reporter girlfriend, Katie Beranek, in these stories. She's been in all the stories from the first book on. She was a news reporter in the first book who kind of broke some of the stories about James Reece's activities and the death of his family and all that. She latched on to that story, a conservative news reporter. And so she's been a developing character throughout, and now, these books require a mandatory love interest. And so you have the tragedy of Reece losing his wife and child in the first book, but now there's a growing love interest to the plot. So she's grown increasingly important in the stories. Here we see her training with Reece somewhat. I mean, they describe some of the training that she goes through with Reece because he wants her, she's been threatened in dangerous situations repeatedly throughout the books. So now, Reece is training her up, right? Well, that has paid off in this story because there's one particular fight scene that is terrifying, it's fascinating, and it's satisfying. Her loyalty and love for Reece finds her in a horrible situation, and she takes care of business, so to speak. So now, though, in this book, there's another strong female lead. It's Dr. Haley Garrett, who I wonder if she's going to show up in other books later, because she really came across as a very strong character in this book. And she's longtime best friend of Katie Beranek, Reece's girlfriend. So Dr. Garrett, though, studies hemorrhagic viruses from Africa, and she plays the heroine in this story. She accompanies Reece on a key part of the mission where she sees Reece's brutality and at first recoils, but soon after comes to understand and appreciate what Reece has to do. And that was an odd piece of character development. You don't see that very often, and I really appreciated that. Part of what Carr does in his novels is he portrays American politics and politicians, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So he's got good guys versus good guys, and here President Christensen, though a Democrat, is a good guy. Then there's a Senator Edward Thwaites, presumably Republican. I don't think that ever stated it explicitly, but he's from the opposite party, so that would be a Republican. And he's one of the bad guys, clearly. He's out to win. He's out to embarrass the president, regardless of the cost to America. So this is a guy who's out just for number one, and he doesn't care what it costs the country. I like to think that Carr is trying to be fair here by presenting a good Democrat versus a bad Republican. And I know there are lots of bad Republicans, but are there any longer any good Democrats? Sorry, I had to say that. So this part of the plot, I have to wonder about why did Carr play it that way? I'm not sure. Another character who plays a key role in the subplot, the political subplot, is Eric Sawyer, who represents the real-life Eric Prince, former Navy SEAL, about the same age as Carr. Carr probably knew him. And Eric Prince is the founder of Blackwater. And in the book, Eric Sawyer founds something very similar, a private security company. Very rich, all that. So in the book, he's a bad guy, though, and is brought to justice ultimately. So this makes me wonder if Carr maybe doesn't care much for the real Eric Prince, much at all, or is this kind of an insider joke within their community? Hey, Eric, I'm going to include you in the story. I'm going to make you a bad guy. Who knows? I'm not sure of where Carr's coming from with that. Now, the plot does have a satisfactory conclusion, but it's a complex conclusion. It really, at least 4 stages. The main terror plot involving the release of a bioweapon, that concludes first and concludes very nicely without a resort to the ultimate solution that is revealed as part of the plot and is probably a real thing. But then comes justice to the main bad guy of the terror cell. And that kind of happens in 2 different stages. And so that was fascinating. And that sequence, that whole sequence of what happens to the main bad guy, reminded me of the TV show 24 with Jack Bauer. Yeah, this is a Jack Bauer sequence, definitely. But then there's an even better resolution to that story that involves the United States Air Force. That was surprising. And again, it portrays the president as a man with balls. Now, there's a conclusion to the Senator Thwaites and Eric Sawyer subplot story. Again, that's a little bit surprising. And then the big surprise at the end, where there's something going on inside Iran, shall we say. Nicely done, Commander Carr. Now, what's the message of this book? This is a book with a message, and you'll see that frequently in this genre of thrillers. You got all the espionage and politics, the terror, and all that, bad guys versus good guys. That's obviously the main meal, but there tends to be a theme or a message, cultural commentary that goes along as part of this genre. So Carr's first volume, The Terminal List, is all about corruption in the military-industrial complex, the political sphere. But make no mistake, it was about personal vengeance, wrath. To me, Terminal List was very much like the opening of the Iliad. Seeing of the anger of Peleus' son, Achilles. The anger and wrath of Achilles is the theme of the Iliad. And Terminal List, and to an extent the whole series, is about the anger of one James Reece, right? The Devil's Hand continues that theme. It's a story of vengeance, a person or actually 2 persons rising to power so that they can hunt down those who harmed them years before. But then in a twist, Carr shows us that the Iranians are doing the same thing. Here is a bit of a gray zone. Carr presents the Iranian point of view in a compelling manner. And that's actually true for warriors, is they understand their enemy. They see where their enemy's coming from. Now, clearly, Carr takes the side of the U.S., but his coverage of the Iranians is fair and interesting, and I think accurate. That's a part of the message. Never forget that the other guy has his understanding of history and the universe. Now, Carr wrote this book during the COVID year of 2020 and wove that into his story masterfully at several levels. He shows the biological warfare side, but also, and more interestingly, the social political side effects of our response to COVID. He gets inside the heads of the terrorists, and he sees how they saw the signs of weakness in the American public and political system because of COVID, and the George Floyd riots as well. They viewed those as part of the weakness of America. And this was genius on Carr's part. The Iranians' view of America was that we were weak, divided, and prone to stupid reactions, and this guides them in their terror plot. Perhaps the strongest message given by Carr in the book pertains to immigration and the idea of sleeper cells that have been in America for decades. So I'm going to read a passage here from page 149. The regime had groomed him since birth through his parents, who were long-term penetration agents. The Americans were so stupid. Why they kept allowing the sons and daughters of those who wanted to destroy them inside their country baffled him. You did not see Americans flocking to Iran, Russia, China, or North Korea to conduct subversion operations and change the fabric of those societies. That is why those countries would endure and why America was doomed to fail. That's a fascinating perspective from the Iranian side. Here's another quote from page 427. Your country is on its knees, Commander. Your response to COVID surprised even our brightest minds. Close down your schools and businesses and destroy your economy for a virus with less than 0.3% mortality rate? With that kind of a response, what would you do with a respiratory virus with a 90% mortality rate? I wanted to call the operation off. You were already doing such a good job destroying yourselves from within. Oof. All we needed to do was sit back and watch as COVID, race riots, and identity politics further divided an already weak nation. It's just a matter of time. Preach it, brother. Preach it. Well, in conclusion, Carr's works right up there with the top thriller writers. I equate him with Brad Taylor. I've got, quite a few of Taylor's books about Pike Logan. Tom Clancy, I read, 30, 40 years ago. But Carr writes as an insider, much like Brad Taylor, one who's been there, done that. He writes as an American patriot. It's encouraging to see the veterans of our 20-year-long war continuing to make an impact after their retirement from active duty. So I would say, read this book, buy all four, read all four. This is well worth your time. This is Stab the Dragon, in hoc signo vinces, out here.